The rusty train sat forgotten on the edge of an overgrown rail yard, its metal frame groaning softly as the wind pushed through broken windows and loose panels. Dust drifted through the narrow corridor as a small figure stepped inside, the air trembling with the smell of iron and cold oil. His hand, trembling and thin, brushed against the peeling paint of the final cabin door, where a faded number 7 hung crookedly. Something metallic clinked faintly inside, as if a secret had been waiting for years just to move at his touch. When the boy pushed the door open, the dim light revealed an object lying in the center of the floor, something that should not have been there. Something that would force him to confront everything he thought he knew about where he came from. 10-year-old Mason had grown used to being overlooked. The foster home where he stayed was always filled with noise, televisions humming, footsteps echoing, doors closing too fast, and the low murmur of adults trying to maintain order. Yet somehow, even within that crowded space, Mason lived in a quiet world of his own. He often sat near the window of the shared common room, tracing lines on the fogged glass with his fingertip while watching the distant shapes of passing trains. The sound of metal wheels rolling over the tracks had become a strange comfort to him, something steady in a life where little ever stayed the same. But he never expected trains to be anything more than background noise, certainly not something that would tie him to a past he had never been allowed to know. The morning everything changed began like any other. Gray skies, the cold smell of detergent lingering in the halls, and the feeling of waking up before anyone else because sleep didn't come easily. Mason sat with his knees pulled to his chest, listening to the building settle. Then came the knock at the front entrance, a firm, unfamiliar sound that made the walls seem to stiffen. Adults moved quickly, their voices lowered, their steps sharper. Mason didn't think it had anything to do with him. He rarely assumed anything did. Yet a few minutes later, a staff member called for him, her expression tight but not unkind. She explained only what was necessary. Someone had arrived with documents that required his presence. The words felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. Mason followed silently, the wooden floor creaking under his socks, his palms growing cold as he approached the visitor waiting in the hallway. The man was dressed neatly, carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked older than Mason himself. His posture was formal, but there was a softness in his eyes, an unmistakable hesitation, as if he was preparing to deliver news he didn't fully understand. Mason stood still, uncertain. The man opened the briefcase, retrieved a thin envelope sealed with an official stamp, and stated that a distant contact, a person whose name Mason didn't recognize, had left behind a property designated specifically for him. Not a house, not money, not land, but a fully decommissioned passenger train stored in an abandoned rail yard on the outskirts of the old industrial district. For a moment, Mason couldn't process it. A train? How could a child inherit something so strange? His chest tightened, not with fear, but with a quiet ache that came from the sudden reminder that his own story had blank spaces no one had ever filled in. Questions gathered in his mind, but they didn't form into anything he could speak aloud. Instead, he nodded. The man handed him the official papers, cold, stiff, smelling faintly of ink, and informed him that arrangements had been made for him to visit the rail yard later that day. As he returned to his room, Mason stared at the envelope, tracing the edges with careful fingers. The sensation was unfamiliar, heavy, almost electric. It felt like holding something that didn't belong to him, yet somehow always had. He slipped the envelope into the pocket of his worn jacket and waited for the hours to pass, each minute stretching into the next like an unanswered question. When they finally arrived at the rail yard, the sky was a washed-out shade of silver, the air damp with the smell of metal and wet earth. Mason stepped out of the car and looked around. The place seemed forgotten by time. Rows of rust-eaten train cars resting on broken tracks, weeds curling around wheels that hadn't turned in decades. A cold wind swept across the open space, brushing against his hair and tugging at his jacket. The official led him forward, pointing toward a specific car, the one he had inherited. It looked older than the others, its once bright paint now reduced to reddish-brown flakes clinging to the metal. Mason approached it with slow steps, feeling as though he was moving towards something that had been waiting for him long before he ever knew it existed. He climbed the narrow metal steps, each one groaning under his weight. The interior was dim, filled with the sharp smell of rust and dust. Faint beams of daylight filtered through broken windows, illuminating floating particles that swirled like tiny ghosts. Mason walked slowly down the aisle, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He had never been inside a train that wasn't crowded with passengers. This one felt almost sacred, almost alive. Toward the end of the car, the corridor narrowed. Mason's eyes adjusted to the shadows as he reached the final cabin. Its door hung slightly open, as if someone had once left in a hurry or never returned at all. He raised a hand, hesitated, then pushed gently. The hinges cried out, revealing the small compartment inside. At first glance, it looked empty. Just old benches, peeling wallpaper, and dust claiming every surface. But then Mason noticed something on the floor. A small object partially hidden beneath a layer of dirt, reflecting a faint glimmer of light. He crouched down, brushed the dust away, and uncovered a thin metallic box with a faded insignia engraved on the top. The moment he touched it, a strange wave of recognition washed over him, an instinctive pull he couldn't explain. It felt familiar, though he had never seen it before. Whatever was inside this box had been waiting for him. Something connected to the life he had lost before he ever learned how to remember it. Mason held the small metallic box in his hands as if it were something fragile, something that might dissolve the moment he exhaled too sharply. The weight of it was surprising, heavier than he expected for something so thin. He brushed more dust from its surface, revealing faint scratches that ran along the edges, scratches that looked deliberate, almost like someone had tried to remove a name or a mark long ago. The box felt cold even through his fingers, the kind of cold that did not come from the weather, but from years of silence. He pressed his thumb gently against the lid, but it did not open. There was no visible lock, no hinges, no seam he could pry. It looked like something designed to stay closed until the right moment or the right person touched it. He slipped the box into the inside pocket of his jacket, feeling its weight settle against his chest. A strange warmth spread through him, not physical warmth, but a sharp awareness that whatever waited inside that box was not random. It belonged to him in a way few things ever had. As he stepped out of the train car, the wind brushed against his face, bringing with it the smell of old machinery and distant smoke. The world around him felt different now. It was as if the rail yard had shifted from being a forgotten grave of metal to a place where answers were buried. The official who accompanied him signaled that it was time to leave, but Mason lingered for a moment, staring at the entrance of the train as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. There was no movement, only the faint rattle of loose panels as the wind moved through the skeletal frames of other trains. When he finally turned away, he kept his hand pressed lightly over the box inside his jacket, grounding himself in the unfamiliar sense of connection it provided. The ride back to the foster home felt longer than usual, each bump in the road reminding him that he was returning to a life that had always felt borrowed. But now something was different. The box pressed against his ribs with every movement, reminding him that a part of his story had not been erased, only hidden. He watched the landscape pass through the fogged window, the dull shapes of buildings and leafless trees blurring together. The world outside looked unchanged, but inside him, something had started to unravel. When he returned to his room, the air felt colder, the shadows sharper. He sat on the edge of his bed, pulling the box from his jacket with slow, careful motions. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of a washing machine and occasional footsteps in the hallway. Mason held the box up to the weak light coming through the window, tilting it slowly. For the first time, he noticed something subtle, a small indentation near the corner, almost invisible unless the light hit it in a specific angle. He traced it gently. It felt like a pressure point, something that required intention rather than force. He pressed his fingertip firmly against the indentation. At first, nothing happened. Then, the box emitted a faint click, soft as a breath. The lid rose slightly, releasing a thin line of dust into the air. Mason's pulse quickened. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation so deep it hurt. He lifted the lid completely. Inside was a folded piece of thick, yellowed paper, worn soft at the edges. Beneath it lay a small, rusted train ticket with a faint number printed on it, and a narrow strip of fabric that looked like it had once belonged to a coat or a bag. Mason stared at the items, unsure which one to touch first. The ticket caught his attention. The number printed on it was the same number that hung crookedly on the final cabin door, 7. He reached for the folded paper next. It had been folded many times, the creases deep, as if someone had held it often, perhaps opening it, closing it, hesitating each time. Mason unfolded it with slow, deliberate care. The paper crackled softly, releasing a faint smell of dust and time. Something old, something forgotten. On the inside, there were only a few lines written in faded ink. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, and achingly familiar in a way Mason could not understand. He traced the letters with his fingertip, feeling a strange heaviness settle inside him, like a memory he couldn't grasp tugging at the edge of his thoughts. The words did not reveal a full story, only fragments. References to a journey, to fear, to a promise. A mention of a child. A reference to the last cabin. And at the bottom, the faint outline of an initial, just one. Curved, soft, almost ghostly, the letter A. Mason stared at it, his breath shallow. It meant something, he could feel it, but the meaning was still out of reach, buried somewhere deep in the past. He leaned back against the wall, clutching the paper as though it might disappear if he loosened his grip. His mind drifted to the few pieces of information he had been told about his origins. None of it matched the fragments written in front of him. He had always been told he was found near a train station, wrapped in a blanket with nothing that identified him, nothing that connected him to anyone. Yet here in his hands was proof that his story had not begun in emptiness. Someone had written these lines for a purpose. Someone had expected this moment. Mason folded the paper again, more carefully this time, and placed it back into the box along with the ticket and the strip of fabric. The box felt heavier now, as if the truth it held had shifted from silence to pressure. He closed the lid gently and placed it beside him on the bed. The room around him felt different. The air was thick with something unspoken, something he could not yet name. Mason knew only one thing for certain. The train was no ordinary inheritance. It was a message left for him long before he knew how to read it, and whatever awaited him next would not be found within the walls of the foster home. It would be found back in that final cabin, where the number 7 hung crookedly, and where the past had waited patiently for him to return. The next morning arrived with a muted glow that barely touched the frost gathering on the windows of the foster home. Mason woke long before anyone else, long before the noise of footsteps and hurried routines filled the hallways. He lay still for a moment, feeling the metallic box resting under his pillow, as if afraid that moving too quickly might break the fragile thread connecting him to everything he had discovered. The faint chill of the morning air pressed against his skin as he slipped the box out and held it close. The paper inside, the brief message, the initial, the strip of fabric, the train ticket, pulled at him with a steady gravity,
an insistence that felt impossible to ignore. He dressed quietly, moving in a practiced silence that came naturally from years of learning not to disrupt others.
The air inside the home smelled faintly of old wood and laundry detergent, familiar scents that usually grounded him, but today they felt distant, muted. Something inside him had shifted. The world that surrounded him suddenly felt too small, as if his life had been confined to a narrow frame while something vast waited just beyond it. With the box secured in his jacket, he slipped out of the building and stepped into the morning. The sky was a pale shade of blue, washed clean by the cold. Mason walked quickly, his breath forming soft clouds that dissolved in the air behind him. The path to the rail yard was long, winding through cracked sidewalks and past abandoned warehouses that loomed like silent witnesses to forgotten stories. Each step carried a sense of urgency he could not explain. He felt pulled, not by choice, but by something deeper, something that had always been part of him even before he knew to look for it. When he reached the edge of the rail yard, the world seemed to fall into a quiet, suspended stillness. The air carried the sharp, metallic scent of rust and lingering smoke from distant factories. The broken tracks stretched out like veins, threading through rows of aging train cars whose colors had faded into shades of exhaustion. Mason paused for a moment, absorbing the eerie calm of the place. The train he had inherited stood at the center, the sun catching the rust in a way that made it glow faintly, like a dying ember refusing to fade. He approached the steps and climbed into the train, feeling the familiar groan of the metal beneath him. Inside, the air was cooler, heavier. Dust drifted lazily in the beams of light falling through shattered windows. The silence carried a strange weight, as if the walls themselves remembered the footsteps of people long gone. Mason moved down the aisle, keeping a steady hand against the wall to guide him through the dim space. As he made his way toward the final cabin, the one marked with the crooked number 7, he noticed details he had missed the day before. The faint outline of old footprints etched into the dust. A loose piece of wallpaper curling at the edges, revealing an older layer beneath it. A faint scratch on the floorboards that ran in a straight line toward the cabin at the end. Each detail felt deliberate, as if guiding him forward. When he reached cabin 7, he hesitated. Standing in front of the door felt different today. There was a sense of expectancy in the air, a quiet tension that made his pulse slow and deepen. The door looked even more worn than he remembered, its edges chipped, its paint peeling in thin vertical lines. Mason pushed it open with a careful motion. The hinges gave a low, aching groan. Inside, the cabin was exactly as he had left it, silent, dim, carrying the faint smell of aged wood and cold metal. But now, knowing what he had found inside the box, the space felt charged with meaning. The bench cushions, long torn and flattened, seemed to hold memories he could almost sense. The small overhead compartment hung slightly open, revealing nothing but shadows. The window, fogged with age and grime, allowed only a thin slice of daylight to enter, casting a faint line across the floor. Mason sat on the narrow bench and placed the metallic box beside him. The wood beneath him creaked softly, as though acknowledging his presence. He let his gaze drift across the cabin. It was not large, barely enough room for 2 benches facing one another and the small storage compartments overhead. But its smallness made it feel intimate, like a place built for secrets. A place where whispers of the past might linger in the cracks. He opened the box again, letting the cold air inside the cabin touch the items within. Carefully, he removed the ticket and laid it on the bench. The number 7 printed on it seemed to echo the crooked metal digit hanging outside the door. Then he unfolded the small piece of paper once more, studying the handwriting, the hesitant strokes of ink, the faint mention of fear and a promise. The letter A glowed faintly in the slanted light. Something inside Mason shifted. A faint memory, too blurred to grasp, flickered at the edge of his thoughts. like a muffled voice or a warmth he couldn't explain. He pressed the fabric strip between his fingers. It was soft despite its age, and the frayed ends carried a faint scent of something he couldn't name. Something almost comforting, something that tugged at him with an ache he didn't fully understand. He knew that to uncover the truth, he needed to search deeper, not just inside the box, but inside the cabin itself. He scanned the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Every corner seemed untouched, yet somehow intentional. His gaze landed on a narrow panel near the floor, its edges slightly uneven as if it had been removed before. Mason knelt beside it and ran his hand along the seam. The wood felt different here, less smooth, slightly warmer. He pressed gently and the panel shifted. The sound it made was soft, almost apologetic. Mason pulled the panel open, revealing a small compartment hidden beneath the floorboards. Dust rose in a faint cloud, settling around the edges of the opening. Inside lay another object, larger than the metallic box, wrapped tightly in worn brown paper and secured with a faded string. Mason reached inside and lifted it out, surprised by its weight and the careful way it had been wrapped. He sat back on the bench and placed the parcel on his lap. His fingers trembled slightly as he removed the string and unfolded the paper. Inside was a small leather-bound journal, cracked at the spine and darkened with age. He held it with both hands, feeling the soft give of the worn cover. This was not something left behind by accident. This was something hidden deliberately, something meant to be found by someone specific, someone like him. The first page of the journal held a single date written in the same delicate handwriting as the note. Beneath it, a few short lines hinted at a journey taken in secrecy, a sacrifice made in fear, and someone who had been forced to leave behind more than they could bear. Mason felt a deep pull in his chest, a quiet, painful recognition. The answers he sought were buried in these pages. And as he closed the journal with careful hands, he understood something with absolute clarity. Everything he had believed about his past was about to change. Back at the foster home, the journal felt heavier in Mason's hands than its size could justify. He carried it pressed against his chest under his jacket, as if cold air might somehow seep into the pages and erase what they contained. The building's familiar noises wrapped around him. The muffled sound of a television, the faint rattle of dishes, the low creak of someone moving upstairs. But for the first time, they did not fully reach him. His attention stayed anchored to the object he held, to the roughness of the leather under his fingers and the faint scent of dust and old ink rising from it. It felt like a pulse from another life, beating quietly in his arms. He waited until the halls grew quieter, until footsteps faded and the home settled into its usual evening rhythm. In the small shared bedroom, the dim light from the window spread across the floor in a pale rectangle, just large enough for him to sit within. He closed the door gently, sat cross-legged near the window, and placed the journal in his lap. The metallic box rested nearby, its lid closed, the folded paper and ticket inside now acting as silent witnesses. Outside, the sky deepened, and a soft bluish gray climbed the walls as day surrendered to night. Mason opened the journal to the first page. The date written at the top was older than he was by exactly 10 years, matched almost to the month of his birth. Beneath the date, the handwriting flowed in gentle curves and careful strokes. The early entries described a woman's life in fragments. Someone who worked long hours around trains, cleaning cabins, carrying supplies, watching passengers come and go while remaining invisible to all of them. The description of the work was detailed enough for Mason to imagine it. Tired feet, uniforms that never quite fit, the constant clatter of wheels, and the metallic song of tracks beneath the train. As he turned the pages, he realized the journal's author had spent most of her life on these routes, traveling back and forth, always returning to the same station as if tethered by something unseen. It did not take long for her tone to shift from routine to unease. The entries began to mention a secret she could not share, a creeping fear that settled in her chest at night, and an awareness that something within her life was about to change forever. Mason's eyes traced the lines, his fingers trembling slightly as he absorbed each detail. Eventually, he reached an entry that no longer referred to long shifts or to the discomfort of standing for hours in swaying corridors. Instead, it spoke of a new heartbeat. The author described carrying a weight that was not exhaustion, but a life growing silently, hidden beneath the fabric of her uniform. She wrote about nausea, fatigue, and the way she began to lean against the cabin walls when the train curved too sharply. There was fear threaded through every line. Fear of being discovered, fear of the station authorities, fear of her own family's reaction, and a larger fear of raising a child alone. Mason read the descriptions of those days with a tightness building in his chest. The woman wrote about the sound of trains turning into a kind of lullaby, how she would rest a hand over her stomach when the cabin was empty, feeling the rhythm of the tracks beneath her feet and imagining it calming the child she carried. She wrote of wanting to give that child a life far away from the narrow streets and sharp voices she had grown up with, far from the stale air of cramped apartments and the coldness of relatives who believed love was something to be rationed. Page after page, the entries moved closer to a decisive moment. The woman's fear did not fade, it sharpened. She began to mention someone who had promised to help, a person who worked at the station, someone who understood the comings and goings of trains and the quiet places where people could vanish without leaving a trace. She described their plan not in full, but in outlines and hints. A particular journey, a final route. A day when she would board the train not as a worker, but as a passenger carrying everything that mattered to her in a single bundle. When Mason reached the entries dated closest to his birthday, the words on the page grew unsteady, the ink darker in some places, smudged in others, as if written by a hand tremoring between dread and hope. The author mentioned Cabin 7 by number, describing it as a place that man had promised would remain empty on that trip, a small compartment at the end of the train where she could sit unnoticed. There she planned to decide what to do, whether she had the courage to disappear with the child or whether the danger would follow them regardless of the distance. Her fear solidified into something heavier when she wrote about the people who might come looking for her, those who believed she had no right to make choices for her own life, who believed that a child born outside their control was better erased than acknowledged. She described the way their words had cut into her, the way their threats had stolen sleep from her eyes long before the baby was due. A sense of urgency dripped from every sentence, like rain pooling at the edge of a roof before spilling over. Then came the final entries. Mason's breath slowed as his eyes scanned the lines. The woman described the night the journey began. She wrote about stepping onto the train with her heart pounding, holding a small wrapped bundle close against her, listening to the engine come to life. The train moved, carrying them away from the only station she had ever known, away from voices that had never truly welcomed her. But as it did, she felt the shadow of those same voices reaching for her, a fear that they would trace her steps, follow the path, and rip the future from her arms. What followed was fragmented but clear enough to pierce Mason's chest. The woman wrote about realizing that the safest place for the child might not be at her side, but in the care of someone who could remain when she could not. She described the station worker, the same person later listed as a family contact who had promised to keep the last cabin as a safe space, to watch over the train, to make sure that any child left there would not be forgotten. The woman wrote that if she did not return to that cabin by the time the journey ended, the worker would know something had gone wrong and would follow a separate set of instructions.
Those instructions included contacting the authorities, surrendering the child into care, and leaving the train as a quiet memorial to a life interrupted. But they also included one more step: preserving this final cabin as it was, keeping the journal, the small box, and the little details intact, so that one day, when the child was old enough, he might be brought back to this place and allowed to find what she could not find for herself: a sense of truth. Mason's throat burned as he read. The words did not need to say his name to press their weight into him. The journal did not explicitly state that the child was a boy, nor did it describe his face. But it noted the date, the train, the cabin, and the station where the journey began and ended. All of it matched what little Mason had been told about his past. Found near the station, wrapped in a blanket, with no identifying information. That had never been the whole truth. The truth had been carefully divided between official records and this hidden space, sealed away in leather and wood and dust. The final written entry came suddenly. There were no gradual goodbyes, no long farewell.
It ended on a description of the train slowing, of a sense of something closing in, of a decision made in a rush of terror and love. The author wrote of placing the child in cabin 7, on the bench near the window, wrapping him tightly in cloth, leaving the metallic box nearby, and the journal hidden beneath the floor. She described the taste of metal in her mouth as she stepped away, the way her hands shook, the way she forced herself to walk down the corridor and step off the train into the uncertainty waiting on the platform. After that, there were no more words. The remaining pages were blank. Mason sat completely still, the journal open on his lap, the darkness in the room deepening until the words on the page were barely visible. He felt as if he had been set afloat on a sea of quiet devastation, one where every wave carried both grief and gratitude. He understood now that he had not been left behind because he was unwanted. He had been left because someone believed it was the only way to save him. His abandonment had not been a careless act, but a deliberate sacrifice etched into these pages. His chest ached with a sorrow that felt both new and old. Tears gathered without drama, pressing against his lashes until they finally slipped down his cheeks in slow, steady lines. He did not sob or tremble. The emotion settled deeper than that, sinking into bone and breath. For so long, he had imagined his past as an empty space, a blank beginning that began and ended with the word orphan. Now, that space was filled, not with easy comfort, but with difficult truth. The train had been more than a property transferred to his name. It had been a vessel for a story someone had fought to preserve. The station worker who had acted as the contact had obeyed instructions faithfully, keeping the train decommissioned but intact, ensuring that neither time nor indifference would erase what happened in cabin 7. That person had eventually grown old or passed away, leaving the last legal act to a lawyer who likely did not understand the full weight of what he was doing when he handed a thin envelope to a boy in a foster home. Mason closed the journal carefully, running his hand over the worn cover as if offering silent thanks to the person whose voice had carried across a decade to reach him. His world had changed in the span of a few pages. The loneliness he had carried for years had not vanished, but it had shifted shape. It now rested beside the knowledge that someone had loved him fiercely enough to risk everything and then vanish rather than surrender him to a life of control and harm. Yet questions still lingered. The journal revealed the choice, the fear, the plan, but it did not tell him what had happened after the woman stepped off the train. It did not explain whether she had survived, whether those who threatened her had found her, or whether somewhere beyond the city limits she had carved out a life that she could never share with him. It did not say whether she had watched from a distance, or whether her story had ended the same day his life in the system began.
These unanswered questions settled over him like a second layer of night. They did not erase what he had learned, but they refused to let him rest in simple acceptance. As he placed the journal back into the metallic box and shut the lid with quiet care, he understood that knowing the truth about his origin was only the first step. The past had finally spoken, but it had done so in half-finished sentences. The rusty old train had not only carried his mother's last decision, it now carried his choice as well. In the days that followed, the world outside Mason's inner life continued as if nothing had changed. The same routines flowed through the foster home: the clatter of dishes at mealtimes, the dull flicker of an old television, the shuffle of feet up and down the stairs. Children argued, laughed, and disappeared into corners with their own private battles, while adults tried to keep order with limited patience and stretched nerves. Yet for Mason, everything had shifted. The metallic box, the journal, and the knowledge they contained had quietly rearranged the center of his existence. He returned to the train whenever he could, slipping away during the hours when supervision thinned and everyone assumed he was simply keeping to himself as usual. The path to the rail yard became familiar enough that he could follow it almost without thinking. Each time he climbed the rusting steps and entered cabin 7, the space felt less like an abandoned relic and more like a private sanctuary. He sat on the worn bench with the journal open across his knees, rereading sections he already knew by heart. The woman's words mapped themselves over his memories, filling in the blank spaces with a clarity that hurt and healed in equal measure. Yet, the more time he spent in the train, the more fragile his connection to it began to feel. Even as he turned the pages, an uneasy awareness grew inside him, an understanding that the world beyond this narrow cabin would not quietly allow such a place to exist indefinitely. The rail yard was part of an old industrial area often spoken of in hurried administrative tones, mostly as a zone needing clearance, reallocation, or redevelopment. The train might have survived for a decade as a forgotten object of bureaucracy and neglect, but Mason knew neglected things did not stay untouched forever. They were either discarded or discovered for purposes outside their original intent. One afternoon, as he approached the rail yard, a new detail entered the landscape: a bright plastic sign attached to the chain-link fence surrounding the property. Its colors were jarring against the brown and gray of rust and earth, announcing a future that had nothing to do with old trains or hidden journals. From a distance, Mason could not read the words clearly, but he understood the meaning without needing to. The sign represented change, someone's plan, someone's decision, someone's claim over a place he had only just begun to call his own. The unease that had been quietly building inside him sharpened into something heavier. He climbed the train steps with a different awareness that day, as if each creak under his feet reminded him that the structure was temporary in more ways than one. Inside cabin 7, he unfolded the journal and traced his fingers over the ink, but his focus slipped repeatedly. He found his gaze drifting to the window, to the slice of sky made smaller by the surrounding metal. The train, once merely a container of secrets, now sat under an invisible countdown he could not see but could feel. Time, which had once been his enemy in the form of long, empty days, was now something he wished he could slow. Back at the foster home, small changes began to ripple through his daily life as well. Staff members who had rarely spoken to him beyond necessary instructions now watched him more closely. The thin envelope containing the inheritance documents had not stayed forgotten in a drawer. It had circulated through hands that saw in it not the emotional weight it carried, but the complications it represented. A minor listed as the owner of an old, decommissioned train in a decaying district was a legal puzzle none of them wanted to manage. Questions flowed up through offices and into systems, leaving behind traces of attention that Mason could feel but not fully understand. A caseworker began to visit more frequently, a person whose presence had once meant little beyond routine check-ins and paperwork reviews. Now their visits stretched longer, conversations with the foster home staff lingering in doorways and offices. Mason was not invited into those rooms, but he felt their content in the way people glanced at him afterward, in the way their expressions softened briefly before hardening into administrative neutrality. He recognized that kind of look. He had seen it in hospitals and waiting rooms, whenever adults did not quite know what to do with a child attached to difficult circumstances. News eventually reached him, not as a clear explanation, but as a slow accumulation of hints and overheard fragments. The rail yard was slated for redevelopment. The land would be cleared, the old trains removed, and likely dismantled. The property, including the train he had inherited, was being evaluated in terms he had never considered: value, liability, salvage, zoning. Paperwork that once seemed like a strange formality now became the centerpiece of decisions made in rooms he would never enter. The realization that the train might be taken from him descended like a dense fog. It did not arrive all at once, but seeped in through cracks. A phrase carelessly spoken, a notice pinned to a wall, a brief mention of deadlines and signatures. With each new piece, the edges of his sanctuary began to crumble in his mind. The train that had once felt eternal in its abandonment was, in truth, as vulnerable as any other object in the path of organized plans. What stung more than the impending loss itself was the way the system moved around him as if he were an incidental detail instead of the person at its center. The inheritance that had been legally attached to his name now became an inconvenience. Adults discussed what to do with it without asking him what it meant. Forms were revised, options weighed, and practical considerations repeated like a litany: safety, liability, feasibility. The story contained within Cabin 7, the journal, the hidden panel, the carefully preserved memory of a woman's sacrifice, did not fit into their categories. For them, it was a decaying object on land earmarked for progress. In the quiet hours when the foster home settled into evening, the betrayal took shape not as a single dramatic moment, but as a steady, suffocating understanding. The very system that had placed the train into his hands now began to slip it away through clauses and recommendations. No one intended cruelty. That almost made it worse. They were simply following procedures, aligning boxes and signatures, talking in neutral tones about reallocations. In their language, the train was not a mother's last gift or a boy's only link to his origin. It was a structure needing removal, an asset needing resolution. For Mason, the knowledge settled like a stone in his stomach. His nights grew restless. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by flashes of metal doors, empty benches, and pages turning in a wind that threatened to scatter them beyond reach. He woke with the sensation of having been chased by something he could not see. During the day, he moved through the foster home with the detached calm of someone who had learned, over and over, that decisions about his life were not his to make. Still, he clung to the train as long as he could. He returned to Cabin 7 whenever opportunities arose, aware that each visit might be the last. He memorized the pattern of cracks in the ceiling, the way the light split in the window at different hours, the exact feel of the bench beneath him. He traced the outline of the crooked number on the door with his fingertips, committing it to memory like a symbol carved into his own skin. He reread the journal so many times that parts of it began to live in his mind as if he had always known them. There were fleeting moments when he imagined holding the journal up in front of the adults, placing it on a desk, and forcing them to read the story it contained. He imagined their faces changing, their tones softening, their planning halted by the weight of understanding. But then he pictured the opposite. Pages skimmed too quickly, the emotional meaning compressed into a brief note in a file. The journal returned to him with a kind but distracted nod. The risk of seeing his mother's words reduced to an administrative footnote felt unbearable. The betrayal were not only external, it pressed against something inside him that had always been tender. For years he had lived with a quiet assumption that he was disposable, a person whose placement, transfer, and future could be decided by signatures and availability. The train had disrupted that belief by proving that someone had loved him with intention.
Now, watching that last physical proof become a line item slated for removal, he was forced to confront a painful collision: personal love against impersonal systems. One had left the journal hidden beneath floorboards. The other was drawing up removal plans without ever stepping into Cabin 7. As the timeline for the redevelopment grew more concrete, so did the measures being taken. Access to the rail yard tightened. Locks appeared on gates that had once hung loosely. Warning signs multiplied, citing safety hazards and restricted entry. The path Mason had walked so often was no longer open. It now belonged to schedules, contractors, and projected dates. The train, still quietly waiting on its broken tracks, stood fenced in not just by metal, but by decisions made in advance. On the day he found the rail yard gates securely locked and the fence reinforced, the truth finally settled fully into place. For all intents and purposes, he had been cut off from the one place where his mother's voice felt close enough to touch. The journal and metallic box remained with him, but the cabin that had held him as an infant, the walls that had witnessed his mother's last act of choice, were on borrowed time. He stood outside the fence for a long while that day, fingers wrapped around the cold metal links, forehead resting against the wire. He listened to the distant echo of industrial noise as machinery moved somewhere deeper within the district. The air smelled of dust and exhaust, heavy with the scent of transformation. The tracks leading into the yard seemed to recede into a future that did not have room for him or the silent story stored in Cabin 7. In that quiet, exposed moment, something inside Mason sagged, not in surrender to indifference, but under the weight of a realization he had spent years trying not to believe. That even when someone fought desperately to protect a child, there were forces in the world that could still strip away the evidence of that love. The journal in his jacket pressed against his ribs, the last tangible link that could not lock away behind fences or pulled apart by demolition equipment. He walked back to the foster home with slow steps, his hands buried in his pockets, his shoulders drawn tight against the cold. By the time he reached the building's door, a fragile resolve had begun to form beneath the grief. The train might be taken apart piece by piece, but its story did not have to vanish in the same way. Somewhere between the sacrifice written in the journal and the indifferent machinery preparing to erase its vessel, there was still a space where he could decide how to carry forward what he had learned. For now, though, the day ended not with answers, but with the painful clarity of loss looming on the horizon, and the quiet knowledge that if he did nothing, the world would quietly dismantle the only place that had ever told him who he truly was. The following days unfolded with the heavy stillness that comes when a child senses the world closing in around something precious. Mason moved through the halls of the foster home like someone walking underwater. Present, responsive when required, yet pulled inward by a gravity no one else could see. The journal remained hidden beneath his mattress, its edges softening from the number of times he had slipped it out to read in the dim yellow light that leaked through the curtains at night. Each sentence written by the woman who had carried him into that abandoned train now held an almost unbearable clarity. Every word felt like a thread pulling him towards something he could not yet name. The notice came on a Tuesday morning, printed on bright paper and affixed to the bulletin board near the front office alongside generic flyers and reminders. It announced the official demolition date of the old rail yard: 10 days. 10 days before the entire district, including the train, would be cleared. For the adults, it was another administrative detail in a life full of logistical concerns. For Mason, it landed like a final countdown inside his chest. Time, which had once felt slow and indifferent, now surged forward in a rush that made it hard to breathe. He knew he could not simply watch the train disappear without doing something, even if he did not yet understand what that something should be. The journal's pages returned to his mind with increasing urgency. There were entries describing repairs the woman had made.
notes about hidden structural reinforcements, and one line he had overlooked before, a mention of a locked maintenance hatch beneath the cabin's floor, sealed not with rusted bolts, but with a handmade mechanism she had constructed herself. Mason had never seen such a hatch in Cabin 7, but the journal described it in detail. A faint square outline, nearly invisible, placed beneath the bench where he usually sat. That night, long after the house had fallen quiet, a realization settled with unmistakable certainty. He had found the woman's journal, the metallic box, the carved wooden token, the photo, but perhaps he had not found everything. Her final secret might still be hidden in the very place that was about to be destroyed forever. The next morning, he slipped out before sunrise. The air was cold enough to sting his face, but the discomfort barely registered. He walked with steady purpose toward the rail yard, tracing the same familiar route even though he knew the gate had been locked days ago. When he reached the fence, he paused only long enough to observe the changes. The locks were heavier. Signs warned of restricted access. Machinery sat farther inside the yard, their silhouettes waiting like dormant threats. There was no path through the main entrance, but years of fending for himself had taught Mason to pay attention to overlooked details. The slight gap between the fence and the retaining wall. The narrow drainage channel no adult would bother to examine. He found a way through, squeezing his thin frame beneath a loose segment of wire where the cold metal scraped against his jacket. Once inside, he rose to his feet and stood still for a moment, heart pounding. The yard around him was silent, the old train half-shadowed by the early morning light. He approached Cabin 7 with a different kind of energy this time, not as a visitor seeking comfort, but as someone returning to a place where the last remaining truth waited to be uncovered. The cabin creaked under his weight as he stepped inside, and the familiar smell, rust, dust, and faint traces of old fabric, wrapped around him like a memory he could physically walk into. He dropped to his knees beside the bench and ran his fingers across the floorboards. At first, the wood felt no different than it always had, smooth in some places, splintered in others, worn by time. But then, beneath one edge, his fingertips brushed against a subtle indentation, a single line almost too faint to detect. He pressed harder, tracing the outline bit by bit until the full square shape revealed itself, exactly where the journal had described. The mechanism that opened the hatch was not immediately obvious. For several long minutes, he searched the seams, feeling for a latch or a loose board. Anxiety began clawing at his chest, telling him the journal might have been wrong, or that the lock had rusted shut decades ago. But then his hand brushed the underside of the bench where a small carved ridge protruded, smooth and warm compared to the surrounding wood. He pressed it gently. A soft click echoed in the cabin, almost inaudible beneath the hum of distant machinery. The floor shifted. A hidden hatch lifted upward just enough for him to grip its edge. Dust rose in a thin cloud as he pulled it open, revealing a narrow cavity beneath the floorboards. The space was dark, its contents wrapped in an old cloth tied with rope. He lifted the bundle carefully, unsettled by how heavy it felt. Up on the bench, he unwrapped it piece by piece. Inside were stacks of folded papers, old photographs, and several handwritten letters. But at the center of the bundle lay an object unlike anything else he had found. A small metal plaque with a serial number and a manufacturing stamp. The numbers matched the faded engraving on the exterior of the train car, but the significance was not immediately clear until he noticed the final letter tucked beneath the plaque, sealed in an envelope with his mother's handwriting. He opened it with trembling fingers. The letter did not contain extravagant confessions or dramatic revelations. Instead, it explained the truth with quiet precision. The train had been decommissioned years earlier, but due to a bureaucratic oversight, it had never been fully transferred out of private ownership.
The woman, his mother, had legally acquired it, not as part of some grand inheritance, but as a symbolic purchase for $1 during an auction no one attended. She had bought the train because she needed a place to hide, to give birth, to protect him from the danger she could no longer fight. The government records she included in the bundle indicated that the ownership documents she had signed were still valid, never nullified, never transferred. The train was, in every legal sense, rightfully his. A warmth spread through Mason's chest, not relief, not triumph, but the quiet, stabilizing weight of truth. All his life he had felt the edges of a story he could never quite touch. Now, for the first time, the threads had gathered into something complete. His mother had not simply left him behind. She had chosen a place, claimed it with intention, and protected it with everything she had left. But the clarity brought with it a new urgency. The demolition was scheduled. Contractors would not pause for a handwritten letter or a faded document tucked beneath an old floorboard. He now possessed proof, but proof meant nothing unless someone saw it, recorded it, acted on it before the machinery arrived to erase the last physical trace of his beginning. He gathered the documents and the plaque with trembling care, arranging them inside his jacket so they would not bend or slip. As he stepped out of cabin 7 one last time, the air seemed colder, the world sharper. He knew that whatever happened next, these truths, once buried beneath wood and dust, were now in his hands. The boy who had arrived at the rail yard months earlier carrying nothing but loneliness and a legal envelope now walked back toward the foster home with the weight of his mother's final act pressed against his heart. The system might not have intended to listen, but for the first time in his life, Mason had something impossible to ignore: the truth, unburied and undeniable. In the days that followed, Mason moved with a different kind of weight in his steps. The documents pressed against his chest beneath his shirt, edged with the faint smell of old paper and metal. He kept the journal close as well, hidden at night and carried discreetly when he dared. For the first time in his life, he held something that could not be argued away as a misunderstanding or a half-truth. His mother's handwriting, the legal forms, the ownership stamp, the symbol of the $1 purchase, all of it formed a quiet shield between him and the emptiness he had once believed was his only inheritance. The process that came next was not quick or gentle. The adults around him reacted with a mixture of confusion, concern, and cautious practicality. He placed the documents into their hands and watched as their faces shifted from mild impatience to surprise and then to something more serious. Meetings were scheduled, calls were made. Offices that had long reduced him to a file number now had to handle something that did not fit neatly into a standard template. A child in foster care who was, on paper, the legal owner of a decaying rail car standing on land slated for redevelopment. The 10-day deadline for demolition did not vanish. Machinery continued to move into position. Fences stayed upright. But the existence of proper ownership records, linked directly to his mother's signed agreements and to his own name, forced the system to slow in small but significant ways. Forms authorizing complete removal of the train were paused. Temporary holds were filed. For the first time, Mason watched a process hesitate, not because of a favor, not because of pity, but because the facts in his hands could not be brushed aside. He soon learned what it meant for something to be legally his, yet physically fragile. Inspectors visited the rail yard. Assessments were made. Reports labeled the train unsafe, obsolete, structurally unstable. It could not be restored easily, nor moved without cost. There were no convenient programs waiting to turn it into a museum piece, no ready-made solutions to preserve Cabin 7 exactly as it was. Every option seemed to involve compromise: partial salvaging, documentation, financial compensation in place of physical preservation. The choice offered to him was not the kind found in stories where everything resolves in a single sweeping gesture. Instead, it was a layered decision shaped by reality.
He could insist on the train remaining where it stood and watch the legal tug-of-war drag on until it collapsed from neglect or was removed under the weight of safety regulations. He could consent to its dismantling and accept that pieces of it would end up as scrap, as raw material folded into other structures that meant nothing to him. Or he could agree to a kind of transformation, allow the old metal to be taken down, but ensure that what truly mattered would not go with it. When the day finally came, the rail yard did not explode into chaos. It unfolded in slow, careful movements. The machinery arrived under a pale sky, engines thrumming with a steady, unhurried power. Workers in reflective vests walked the grounds with clipped boards and steady steps. The air was thick with the scent of fuel, dust, and the faint tang of metal about to be disturbed. Mason stood at a distance allowed by the temporary agreements that had been made. His presence had been formally acknowledged, his ownership written into the record, his consent required for what would happen to the train. Yet no one expected him to stand there. They expected the forms to be signed and the decisions to be processed somewhere far from the site itself. Instead, he watched as the machinery drew closer to the rusted frame that had once been his mother's refuge. In the days leading up to this moment, he had made his decision. With the help of one caseworker who seemed to understand that this was not just about property, he arranged for everything within Cabin 7 that carried direct meaning to be removed and stored safely. The metallic box, the journal, the letters, the plaque, the carved symbol, the strip of fabric, even the crooked metal 7 from the door, all of it had been carefully collected and transferred into protective envelopes and boxes bearing his name. Official scans and copies were made for public record, but the originals remained his. What he could not preserve was the exact air inside the cabin, the sound of footsteps on its floor, the way light broke across its walls at certain hours. Those lived only in memory now, imprinted so deeply he doubted any future day could erase them. The decision he had signed acknowledged that the physical train would be dismantled and removed, but it also guaranteed something else. That part of the metal and wood would be salvaged and set aside, labeled for future use in a small community memorial to be built near the rail line. It would not be a monument grand enough to draw crowds, nor a place of spectacle. It would be a quiet corner, shaped around the story of a woman who had once bought a forgotten train for $1 to protect her child. In the months that followed, he would help design that memorial. For now, he simply watched as the train that had once held his entire unknown past began to come apart. Each groan of metal was a sound that hurt, but it did not undo what he had gained. The journal in his possession, the documents with their stamps and signatures, the photo of his mother's hands holding him as an infant, all of it formed a bridge between who he had been and who he was allowed to become. Back at the foster home, his inner landscape had changed so completely that the building itself seemed smaller. The shared rooms, the narrow beds, the rotating staff, they no longer defined the limits of his world. He began to keep his own notebook, filling its pages slowly in uneven handwriting. He wrote down what he remembered of the train, the smell of rust, the soft dust motes caught in a beam of light, the sound of the floor shifting beneath his weight. He wrote about the woman in the journal, not just as someone distant, but as his mother, a person with calloused hands, aching feet, and a heart that had tried to build a shield in the shape of a train car. He also wrote about himself, for the first time not as a child who had been left behind, but as someone who had been deliberately placed somewhere meant to keep him alive. The difference was subtle yet profound. The word orphan no longer sounded like a verdict. It sounded like a chapter, a part of his story, not the entirety of it. As weeks turned into months, opportunities began to appear where before there had been only repetition. The compensation from the dismantling of the train did not make him rich, but it established a small fund in his name, money set aside for his future education, for housing when he aged out of the system, for choices that would one day be his to make.
The memorial project near the rail line progressed slowly but steadily. One day in the future, he would stand there and see fragments of the train integrated into benches, railings, and a small plaque that told the story of a woman, a $1 purchase, and a child who found his origin in a forgotten cabin. On a quiet evening long after the demolition, Mason sat by the window of the foster home with his own notebook open on his knees. Outside, the distant sound of trains still rolled through the air, a low, steady rumble that no redevelopment could fully erase. He rested a hand over the journal that had once belonged to his mother and over the notebook that now belonged to him. The two volumes formed a small, tangible lineage, her voice and his, separated by time but joined on the same invisible spine. He thought of home, not as a specific building or a legal arrangement, but as something layered. The memory of Cabin 7, the weight of the journal, the future he might build with the quiet strength of knowing where he came from. Family for him existed in pages, in metal salvaged from old tracks, in the knowledge that someone had fought for his life before he was old enough to remember it. The rusty train no longer stood at the edge of the rail yard, but its absence did not feel like emptiness. It felt like a door that had opened instead of one that had closed, leaving him standing on the threshold of something new. He was still a boy in a crowded foster home, still navigating a system that did not always know how to see him. But he was no longer standing in the dark. He had his mother's story. He had his own beginning. And for the first time, the future did not feel like something happening to him. It felt like something he could walk toward, step by careful step, carrying the weight of a $1 train that had changed everything without ever needing to move.